Hi there. We are at chapter 3, The Foundation for A Course in Miracles. In April of 1996, the day came when I found myself on an airplane leaving for New York. I had never been to the States, and in preparation for the trip had watched a good number of English-speaking shows like Twin Peaks and a lot of the original Star Trek Next Generation episodes. My sister's then husband owned a comic book store with access to English language shows and movies. On the plane, I thought about my relationships. I hadn't been very good at them so far. Heike and I had been together for 7 years before we separated. I had had a few shorter relationships, and at the time I left for the foundation, I was living with someone. I knew I was searching, and even though I was aware intellectually of what I was searching for, I couldn't grasp it experientially yet. I was really hoping for some answers. The bus ride from JFK to Roscoe, New York was odd. It was rainy and foggy and I couldn't see anything. I had no idea where I was, and when I got to the bus station, I had to use an American public phone for the first time to call the foundation and let them know I was there. A lovely lady who worked at the foundation picked me up and brought me to the place. My room was in a one-story building that looked like a motel right out of Twin Peaks, with a long front porch that spanned the whole width of the building. I had a small kitchenette and a large window overlooking the covered porch. I still couldn't see anything beyond that, and for the first 2 days the fog was so thick not even the road was visible. I met a few older ladies who had been at the foundation for a while, and they took me under their wing. I called them the Sisters of Mercy. I'm sure they felt pity towards this 30-year-old guy from Germany who had no clue about anything, including the coin-operated washing machines in the laundry room. My English was only about good enough to get by with the basics, and the first couple of runs to the local grocery store were an adventure as well. The workshops hadn't started yet, and everything felt strange and foreign. I began to think that I had made a huge mistake in booking a 3-month stay. I missed home. Jesus was nowhere to be found. I was stuck. On the third day, the fog lifted, and I woke up to a magnificent view of Tanana Lake outside my window. The foundation included several buildings, an old hotel with large dining facilities where the workshops were held, a tennis court, a bocce court, and a dock with rowboats. Those weren't out yet, as this was only the end of April. Back then, there were about 15 staff members who lived and worked at the foundation. Roughly the same number of people were there for a prolonged study period. About 100 people participated in each of the bigger workshops and seminars, and they were smaller group teachings twice a week. The whole place sounded and looked like a regular retreat center. I'd been to those in the past, but realized very quickly that this was different. I couldn't pinpoint it at first. The staff members were friendly, but they did their thing without engaging much with the guests. For me, this was the most spiritual place on the planet, and yet the staff acted like they were running just another motel. A few weeks in, I met Ken Wapnick. He and his wife, Gloria, had just come back from vacation, and he briefly said hello. He was normal. He could have been the mailman or an accountant or perhaps a school administrator. There was nothing special about him. What I didn't quite realize when I first got to the foundation was that this was a place for self-study. The workshops and seminars were aimed for the students to understand the material better, but the main goal was for us to then study the book on our own. It was a very grown-up way of dealing with spiritual growth. The responsibility was 100% with me. Another thing I realized. My ego didn't get much out of the whole thing. I wasn't special. Nobody was. Nothing was. The Course in Miracles wasn't special. The teachings weren't special. There were no prayer circles, no hand-holding or chanting. Most importantly, there wasn't a master teacher or guru. Yes, Ken was the main figure, but the director, and the one who taught most of the classes, but that was only for consistency. There was no ego involved in any of it. Sure, the staff had their issues, their own personal process and such, but the foundation was a teaching center, nothing more. On several occasions, on his tapes, and only half jokingly, Ken mentioned that he needs to get a list of the names of the course groups around the world so he could burn them. This was not a group-centered teaching facility. There was no joining in the usual sense on the physical plane, as the basic premise of A Course in Miracles is that we are already joined. And we need to accept that, rather than working on joining on a worldly level. The gist of it is that this wasn't a place that would stroke my ego to become more spiritual. There were no levels to reach, no goals the foundation provided other than to assist us on our own journey to peace. The best way to describe it is to compare it to a college campus. Students go there to learn a subject. They are responsible for everything. They go to classes, they study, they learn. They have study groups, yes, but solely for the purpose of facilitating one's own learning. There was something deeper there, however. Something very profound. Yet hidden from the observer at first glance. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to embark on a discovery that would change my life forever. In preparation for writing this book, I went through the notebooks I had filled there. To say that the 3 months at the foundation was a very intense period of time is an understatement. On average, I believe I read and studied the course between 5 and 6 hours a day. Other than the occasional grocery run and walk around the lake and maybe watching a movie in the common area here and there was literally nothing to do. I talked to Jesus a lot. It was still very much a one-way street, with me telling him my woes, my thoughts, my insights, etc. I felt once in a while a slight sense of comfort. That was it. The rest of the time I spent wading through a morass of thoughts of guilt, a vague sense of shame, and an almost ever-present knot of fear within me. One of the premises of A Course in Miracles, as a teaching device, is for us to experience that guilt is not real. Guilt is seen as a defense against the love that underlies it, with no reality other than our belief in it. That sounds nice, right? Yes, in the end it is. But the process is grueling, as we cannot let go of our guilt without looking directly at it. Looking at everything within us that we have pushed under the rug and projected onto other people is a slow and at times terrifying ordeal. Much later on, I studied story structure as part of becoming a writer. The hero's journey described, for example, in Joseph Campbell's work, I realized, is a real journey. It is our journey. The only difference is, the work is not on the outside, but within our mostly unconscious mind. Otherwise, the journeys in the legendary stories are identical to our own. We are Frodo on our way to Mount Doom. We are Katniss Everdeen in the arena. The main difference is the enemy is within the confines of our own mind, projected onto the world. Our journey is one of discovery of what and who we are in truth. Everything that doesn't belong needs to be evaluated and, in time, decided against. The workshops began in May, and with them the focal point now became the process of undoing my belief in guilt. A process that had started some years before. Deep inside the mountain, the dragon awaited. I had lost my sword and my shield, and the light grew dim, seemed gone at times. I entered the cave bravely, or so I thought. During the next few weeks, I wrote down everything that was going through my head. The more I wrote, the more came up. I wrote about my family, my difficulties, my failures. I wrote about what I was ashamed of and what I felt guilty about. It mainly had to do with my relationships, judgment towards others, other people, my career, and so on. I discovered some of my secret beliefs and faced my long list of shortcomings. For example, I realized in horror that most of the relationships I was in, romantically or otherwise, were there to get me something. I didn't care so much about the person, but what I could get out of being with them. In short, I questioned everything. You name it, I wrote it down. And slowly but surely the teachings of the Course took hold, meaning I was able to put the contents of my mind within the context of the teachings. It wasn't pretty. I felt as if I was in a maelstrom of my own thoughts that, now no longer hidden, began to overwhelm me. I realized how little I trusted Jesus and how much I expected his judgment for my ego self. Basically, I had nothing to lose and spilled my guts to him, spending my time examining the thoughts within me that would negate him. Everything I would rather do than being with him. everything that I put in between myself and him, and everything I thought had more value. The list was endless. And after a while, I realized that my whole life, all of my thoughts, feelings, deeds, acts, relationships, problems, joys, and triumphs, was nothing but a giant defense mechanism against his overwhelming, unimaginable, and all-encompassing love. This insight was so powerful that I knew I had to change my view of myself and the world completely. That was the most terrifying thing of all. I would love to say that during my stay at the foundation, Jesus became my companion. That is not true. Yes, in a way, he did become my friend. But who and what really became my companion was fear. In chapter 13 of A Course in Miracles, called The Guiltless World, Jesus talks about this fear. Quote, "You have built your whole insane belief system because you think you would be helpless in God's presence, and you would save yourself from his love because you think it would crush you into nothingness. You are afraid it would sweep you away from yourself and make you little because you believe that magnitude lies in defiance and that attack is grandeur. You think you have made a world God would destroy, and by loving him, which you do, you would throw this world away, which you would. Therefore, you have used the world to cover your love, and the deeper you go into the blackness of the ego's foundation, the closer you come to the love that is hidden there. And it is this that frightens you." A Course in Miracles, text 13, 3, 4, 1 through 5. Killing Jesus. When I signed up for this 3 months retreat in Roscoe, I didn't know what I signed up for. I thought I would study my beloved A Course in Miracles and get to know that Jesus fellow a bit more. I should have read the small print. My mind and my heart cracked open, and I laid myself bare before my internal teacher. I was raw and vulnerable, wounded for sure, and my inner defenses were down. And then came the day when I killed him. I woke up one morning in a defiant mood. I didn't feel like studying. I didn't feel like doing anything. No Jesus, no course. I lay in bed and felt anger rise within me. I was angry at Jesus for not responding to me studying his book. How dare he not show himself to me after all I had done for him? For the last few years, I had written to him, committed myself to him, studied his words, and for what? To suffer? To expose my innermost feelings to him and for no return whatsoever? You can go to hell, I told him in my thoughts. I got really angry. I don't get angry a lot, and my first reaction was to push it down, get up, and concentrate on something else. But for some reason, I felt the anger rise up within me. I let the anger rise up within me to see where it would take me. I saw myself in my mind's eye, leaving my room and going onto the veranda. There were people, fellow students out there, and I imagined I started a fight with the one closest to me. I pushed him away from me and walked down the long porch, passing the doors to the other rooms. Most students came out of their rooms, and I fought with each one of them. I punched them, pushed them, kicked them, and threw some of them over the railing or through the large windows, shattering the glass. It was like a scene of a violent action movie playing out in my mind. It became bloodier the further I went. I left a lot of people on the ground bleeding when Jesus appeared at the end of the porch. He wore a robe and sandals and looked just like you'd envision Jesus to look like. He opened his arms. I somehow now held a sword in my hands. It was a long broadsword, heavy and razor sharp. I looked into his eyes and lifted the sword. I didn't hesitate. First, I cut off one of his arms, then the other. Then I sliced him open, stabbed him a few times until I cut off his head with a powerful swing while screaming. Blood splattered everywhere. It was like a scene in Kill Bill. I rammed the sword into the wooden planks. The steel swayed back and forth for a moment, blood dripping from it. I felt triumphant. He's dead, I thought. I'm free. Where the sword touched the planks of the porch, roots grew out of the steel. The sword, still bloody, transformed into the stem of a flower. White lily blossoms grew out of the stem. The sword was gone. What was left was a beautifully, brilliantly white lily. In the Course, white lilies are symbols of forgiveness. I turned around. Looking down at my hands and arms, they were covered in blood. When I lifted my head, I saw Jesus. He stood across from me, fully intact, not a scratch on him. The veranda behind him was empty. He opened his arms again, and this time I stumbled forward. He caught me in an embrace. He held me. "You can't kill me," he said after a while. I broke down sobbing. There was such relief, I can't describe it. We stood like this for a bit before the vision ended and I was back in my bed. I was shaking. The next few days I went back and forth between two basic states: the guilt over having killed him and the absolute relief when realizing that this was impossible. For me to kill Jesus, to come in contact with my hatred toward him, was the only way I could eventually experience his true love and forgiveness. Hatred is a shield we employ so that the love that is behind it stays out of our awareness. It took me years to grasp the implications this had for my life. The Course speaks about a process from darkness to light, through hatred to the love that awaits. We must first look at our hatred to be able to go past it to the love that the hatred has hidden. There's one paragraph in Absence from Felicity where Kenneth Wapnick quotes a page from notes that were also dictated by Jesus, but as per his instructions weren't included in the published course due to their very personal nature. Quote, "You have no idea of the intensity of your wish to get rid of each other. This does not mean that you are not strongly impelled toward each other, but it does mean that love is not the only emotion. You do not realize how much you hate each other. You will not get rid of this until you realize it, for until then you will think you want to get rid of each other and keep the hatred." Kenneth Wapnick, Absence from Felicity. Psychologically, whenever we put someone on a pedestal, we hate them. We feel beneath them, less worthy, and therefore we secretly hate him or her. Jesus, in order to help us, needs to be our brother and on the same level as us. If we think he has more than us, is better or more worthy of love, is God's chosen son, we must hate him and are closing ourselves off to his ability to help us. Looking at this hatred without judgment is a substantial step toward our own healing. The hatred hides the love that is there, and in order to experience the love, we have to first pass through the hatred. To realize that none of my thoughts of negating Jesus, as intense as they had been, had had any effect on his love for me was life-changing. When I had first opened the door to him during the time in my mid-20s when I bought the painting, I had no idea. He was just a figure that I hoped I could come to for comfort once in a while. I was wrong. Back then I was still operating under the premise that I was the sparrow in the sparrow world, and Jesus was nothing but a slightly better sparrow who could maybe possibly help me in a little sparrow life. Little did I know that he was teaching me to soar on the wings of the eagle, inviting me to fly with him. He was also urging me very gently, as he does with everyone who seeks him out, not to accept anything less than that. Quote, "I told you I forgave you, and that meant all hurt and hate you have ever expressed is cancelled. I need the children of light now, and I'm calling you to be what you once were and must be again." Kenneth Wapnick, Absence from Felicity. Laura. One morning, I think it was toward the end of May, I was on my way to class when a woman who walked ahead of me dropped her sweater. I picked it up and gave it to her. We started talking. Her name was Laura. She had fiery red hair and freckles all over her face, and when she laughed, you could hear it throughout the whole dining room, which is where we found each other often. She was also fiercely independent and didn't take any BS from anyone. We started talking to each other during the breaks. On the second day of one of the first week-long workshops, we sat on the dock at the edge of the lake. I remember saying something that Laura didn't agree with, and she pushed me, fully clothed, into the lake. Can you believe it? I climbed out, drenched in lake water. Nobody had ever done anything like this to me. I didn't quite know what to make of it, but I knew I wanted to know more about her as she walked off and left me there to ponder what had happened. Laura was from Connecticut, worked as a recruiter for large corporations, and didn't live at the foundation but in a tiny studio apartment in Roscoe, where she was able to work while at the same time attend the classes. Laura told me that after she had bought the course, she had opened it briefly, read it for 5 minutes, thought it was complete garbage, and closed the book, not to open it for another 3 years. In the meantime, it became the fourth leg of the broken couch in her apartment. For that and for nothing else, it was perfect, she said. She'd had a rough childhood. Though her dad was a very successful dentist in Manhattan and her mom a homemaker, she and her mother didn't get along. At least once when she was young, Laura tried to kill herself, drinking turpentine. Her political views, her views of the world in general, and her overall outlook on life were completely different from my own. She was also 8 years older than me. But despite all that, and despite the fact that I had a girlfriend at home, I fell in love with her. I remember the first time we made out was on my bed at the foundation. It felt so utterly strange to be intimate with someone in a room where I usually spent every minute reflecting on my life with Jesus. I simply couldn't do it. We drove to her apartment and I spent the night there. In the morning we went to the famous Roscoe Diner for breakfast. My first time in an American diner, and it could have been everything I imagined it to be, were it not for the guilt I felt about my girlfriend at home. Laura and I didn't spend that much time together at first. When we were together, we talked about our lives and our relationship, for better or worse, with Jesus. Laura had searched for him for a long time. Where my resistance against his love usually came out in more passive ways, hers was straight out anger and attack. She was openly pissed at him for not helping her more. One time we drove in the car and I read to her from A Course in Miracles. She got really upset and started to cry. It was hard to console her. Here's the line I read. It's from the Manual for Teachers in the Development of Trust section. Quote, "And now he must attain a state that may remain impossible to reach for a long, long time." A Course in Miracles, Manual for Teachers, 41A77. When I read it to her, I jokingly added a couple of more of the word long for good measure. Laura, usually blessed with a great sense of humor, didn't think it was funny. She thought it was devastating. Her journey had been hard and long, and sometimes she was hanging on by a thread. One evening in June, we were in Laura's apartment, and I remember we talked about Jesus and the Course, as we often did, when from one moment to the next, I felt the most intense love I had ever felt in my life. It wasn't romantic love or love between two people. I knew that one well. I didn't know this one. I spoke out loud what I felt at that moment and can still remember it very clearly. I knew with every single fiber of my being, that if we were to let Jesus take control of our lives, we would never, and I mean never, have to worry about anything again, ever. We would be safe in his love, completely and utterly safe. I felt his love as such a vast and all-encompassing presence. I wept while telling Laura what was happening in real time. I realized that I was unable to manage it, and I said that much. It was simply too big. My personal identity was gone at that moment, without me missing it at all. And none of what I had previously thought or felt or known was there. It was literally incredible. Laura and I began to spend more and more time together. If there weren't workshops scheduled, we drove around, visited her friends in Maine, went to the movies, or had dinner out. Yet part of me felt that being with her, as lovely as it was, kept me from doing the work I had come there to do, to study A Course in Miracles. It also made me feel guilty, as I still had a girlfriend at home. Neither of those reasons was enough for me to break it off with Laura. We laughed a lot, we cried a lot, we had sex a lot, we studied and talked and talked and talked. And then we began to talk about what if. What if I would come back and stay with her? Could we make a life together? The three of us, as we jokingly said, Laura, myself, and Jesus. The more I thought about it, the more it became a real notion. I was still far from allowing myself to do it, but I remember it was around my birthday in mid-June that I began to seriously think about it. But that decision was laced in feelings of guilt and shame. Not only did I have a girlfriend at home, but my son was 9 at that time, and I would have to leave him too. Heike had gotten remarried and had another child. Until my journey in Roscoe, I had been visiting with her and my son several times a week, consistently, and I knew it would be hard to make the move for me and for him. I asked for help a lot. I wrote to Jesus a lot. I didn't know what was the right thing to do. It wasn't a clear-cut yes, neither was it a straight no. I didn't receive any words of wisdom from him. I rarely, very rarely, got anything specific. Not then, not now. All I ever got, that sounds bad, but it's really all I could possibly ask for, were moments in which I felt that I was loved, whatever I would decide to do. One other aspect that became front and center during this time was the following. I had it in my head that Jesus wanted me to follow him. In the Course, he says as much, many times in many different ways. I had an image of him walking on a path in the mountains. He had turned around and stretched out his hand, signaling me to follow him. I wanted to. Part of me wanted to, at least. But that was a small part, like a little bud not ready to open up toward the sun yet. It was a misconception on my part that I thought he wanted me to come with him. That's a nice notion, a comforting one, but I put so much pressure on myself, I didn't realize that I set myself up for failure. Yet, yes, there is this theme of the student following the advice of the teacher in the Course. And as Jesus says, if the teacher's goal is to help the student experience less pain, it would be silly not to follow him. But, and that's a big but, the process of following him is not by following him. The process of following him is for his students to realize how much we resist him, how much we want to walk the other way, and how often we actively decide against his gentle guidance. One day while reading in the Course, I realized that for him we are already together. The separateness only exists within me. The notion, therefore, for us to follow him is valid solely as a transitional phase. It's comforting that Jesus wants us to follow him, but once we're with him, we will realize eventually that we have never been apart. In short, in order for us to follow Jesus, all we need to do, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, is for us to acknowledge how much we don't want to be with him. And tell him about it. If you're telling someone 1,000 times a day that you don't want to be with that person, guess what? You obviously want to be with that person. This reflects the basic premise of the Course, that we don't have to search for love, but only for the obstacles we have placed between ourselves and the full awareness of love's presence. Since then, I extended the original image I had of Jesus stretching out his hand, gesturing for me to follow him, into one where we both walk on a path in the mountains together. We never walk together for long, as I am constantly running off to play someplace else. When I return, he sits on a rock in the sun, smiling. I join him once again, and we walk a bit together until I'm off again. He's not waiting in time. He's not in time. He's outside of time. Patience isn't necessary when you're not bound to time. Again, for him, we don't leave him when we wander off into the wilderness. As he doesn't separate from us, all we need to do is return to him, return to the awareness that we are together. Quote, I will love you and honor you and maintain complete respect for what you have made, but I will not uphold it unless it is true. I will never forsake you any more than God will, but I must wait as long as you choose to forsake yourself. Because I wait in love and not in impatience, you will surely ask me truly. I will come in response to a single, unequivocal call. A Course in Miracles, text 4.3.7, 7-10. The more I dove into the teachings, the bigger the fear became, it seemed. I had about a month left at the foundation, and at that point I still spent many hours a day reflecting on my life. I also began to ask Jesus for help with traumatic situations of my childhood. To recount, my parents got divorced when I was 11. My sister, 5 years younger, went with my mother, and I stayed with my father. My dad remarried. My stepmom was, I believe, 20 when they got married, only 9 years older than me. They went out at night often, probably about 3 to 4 times a week. I was utterly terrified of being alone in the house. Not so much afraid that anything could happen to me, but I experienced such deep loneliness, it was almost physically painful. I got in trouble a few times when I packed my bedding and walked a few blocks to my stepmother's parents' house to stay there. The pain was almost unbearable. I remember sitting on the floor in the hallway with every light in the house on until I heard the car come up the driveway. I went to bed and instantly fell asleep. Loneliness was a big item for me, and one I would only truly resolve decades later. For now I decided to invite Jesus into those memories. Quote, "If I am with you in the loneliness of the world, the loneliness is gone. You cannot maintain the illusion of loneliness if you are not alone." A Course in Miracles, text 8, 4, 2, 6, and 7. In my room at the foundation, I thought back to that time as an 11-year-old boy sitting in the hallway, absolutely terrified. This time, I saw Jesus sitting next to me. We didn't really talk much, but I could feel that the terror slowly subsided. During my stay, I went back to that image repeatedly. I think a good portion of the issue was healed during that time. Not all of it. That awaited a few more puzzle pieces later on. Several times a week I attended group classes. Those were small and mostly for the people who were there staying at the foundation longer term. We usually sat on chairs in a circle. One evening, the staff member who taught the class left one chair empty, and after the session started, she brought a framed painting of the head of Jesus. A student had painted it a while back and placed it on the chair. She told us to imagine Jesus would be with us in the circle. It didn't take long when I started to cry. I could feel his love within me and knew that he would be there and lead me through whatever it was I needed to get through at that time. The next morning, however, I woke up with intense fear and the sense that he was nowhere to be found. The Course talks about those two diametrically opposed states of being, where one state completely blots out the other. I recognized more and more then that when I was in one, I had no recollection of the other. In rare moments, when I could feel Jesus' love, my ego mind was gone. When I was in my ego, I couldn't even find a trace of how it had felt to be with Jesus. Sometime during the last month in Roscoe, I made the decision to stay in the States, and Laura and I made plans for me to come back. The day we said goodbye at the airport was one of the toughest days of my life until then. Laura was somewhat of a buffer when I was with her. I had done a good amount of work internally, but there was much to process, and being with Laura had kept a lid on the bottle of my internal struggle. Once I was alone, it hit me in full force. It would take 5 months before I would return to the US. During that time, I woke up every morning in absolute terror. It would subside within 20 minutes or so, but right after waking, I was paralyzed, literally, by fear. Fear continued to be a regular occurrence in my daily life. As I know now and had begun to realize back then, fear is a normal part of any serious spiritual path. The Course's perspective on it is diametrically opposed to anything this world has to offer as far as a solution is concerned. We currently don't call it fear, we call it anxiety. In my experience, anxiety is simply a false name given to a symptom that has nothing to do with anything happening in the outside world. I think anxiety is a word too weak for what is really happening. I think fear, in part, comes up when we transition from one identity to another. Throughout a lifetime, we take on many identities: child, teenager, student, lover, employee, mother, father, grandparent, etc. Sometimes our job becomes our identity for a while. Sometimes we identify with a hobby, like running or hunting or collecting things. Whenever we question this identity, a mostly unconscious process, we experience fear. The Course says that identification is salvation. This means that we identify with something or someone because we believe that this identification will save us. The biggest and most prominent identification is with ourself, our individuality. Joining with Jesus or any other entity that is outside of our ego self must induce intense fear at times, as we literally question our own identity. It is as if we question the very oxygen we breathe. Jesus, as a symbol of love, is a threat to our identification with the ego. Hence, Each time we are in our ego, we are afraid that he will literally kill us the next time we join with him. That's why we make him into something he's not. A magical figure that gives us things, that heals us and helps us in the world. He's much less threatening that way. We can't really deal with a Jesus that doesn't reinforce our individual existence and tells us that the I we think we are is a made-up concept and does not exist in truth. My relationship with Jesus was an oxymoron at that time. It was clear that I couldn't do this without him, but doing it with him felt impossible as well. I'd had enough moments to know without the shadow of a doubt that his presence within me was real. During those moments, fear did not exist. During the rest of the time, though, the other 99%, when I wasn't with him, I was afraid of him. I wasn't afraid of him personally, but of what he represented, an all-encompassing love that I simply couldn't manage. The Course speaks about the drop of water in relation to the whole ocean. We are the drop, believing that we have separated from our home, the ocean. We find ourselves in the desert, a single drop of water, disconnected from our home, in constant danger of being annihilated, in search of other drops that we can connect with. Jesus represents the ocean. He's the means to return, and he symbolizes what we are getting back to. Imagine for a moment you are that single drop of water and you fall from the sky toward the vast, endless ocean where you, as the individual drop, will cease to exist the moment you hit the surface. The fear of losing our individuality is enormous. We don't want to be with Jesus because he not only symbolizes the ocean, he tells us in no uncertain terms that the ocean is the only place we will ever be completely safe, whole, and at peace. But while we think we are the drop of water, our individuality is our safety net. Letting go of this, letting this go, taking Jesus' hand, and following him to the ocean is the very last thing we want. As I mentioned before, it does us no good to proclaim that we love Jesus. We can't possibly love him fully without first admitting we are afraid of him, and unless we realize this, our relationship with him will be limited, and he can only do a fraction of his true purpose for us. During those 5 months back in Germany, and having had several very clear and intense moments of experiencing Jesus' love, I, for the most part, experienced the opposite. My internal struggle was more intense than when I was at the foundation. In Roscoe, I had access to basic support structure through the foundation. I had spoken to Ken, the director, several times throughout my stay, and we had become friends. And I'd had Laura there, of course. Now I was by myself with a long list of items to take care of before I could return, including dissolving the relationship with my girlfriend and getting an interim place to live. It was a very challenging time, during which I felt for the most part that Jesus was nowhere to be found. It wasn't really him, though. It's not like he may or may not show up based on his schedule or how I pray or my worthiness, for that matter. No, his presence is always 100% there, within me and readily available. A shining light in the darkness that never dims. I have only ever been the one pushing him away and substituting all the other thoughts and feelings I experience for his love. It's literally that simple. Not easy, of course, but not complicated either, and not at all dependent on his availability or my ability to pray the right way.